Good evening. My name is Greg Knight and I am one of the conveners of the Renew Illawarra branch. We welcome you to our webinar. Tonight we're going to explore a concept that could reduce Australia's emissions with comparatively little effort. We'll talk about that later. I'm speaking to you from my living room in Wollongong on Dharawal country. And on behalf of the Renew Illawarra Committee, I would like to acknowledge that we are hosting this meeting on the unceded ancestral lands of the Dharawal, Wadi Wadi and Yuin people. We acknowledge and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to country itself. Recent research shows that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have sustainably managed this land for tens of thousands of years. They have achieved this by passing down their accumulated knowledge and applying processes such as the surgical use of fire. They managed the land so that food sources, both plant and animal, were not only sustainable, but abundant, convenient, and predictable. We would do well to ensure this knowledge is incorporated into the future management of this land. Just a little bit of process. Move your mouse over the Zoom screen and at the bottom of the screen see if you can locate a number of buttons. Find the chat and the Q&A buttons. If you have any technical issues during the evening, please use the chat function for assistance and our team will be able to help. By using the Q&A button, you can ask questions of Ty while he's actually speaking. We will go through these questions at the end of this presentation. It is normal that we get more questions than we will have time for, so please be patient. I will be facilitating the Q&A and we will try to get through as many as we can before our closing time of 8 o'clock. Our convener Zach will be recording the presentation and that should be available on the Renew YouTube channel in the next few days. I'd like to thank our team who have made this webinar possible. Firstly, our Renew Illawarra conveners, Carrie Wilson and Zach Nicholson. They're managing this Zoom webinar behind the scenes. They're doing a great job. I would also like to thank the Renew Hub team in Melbourne who have publicised this webinar and arranged the ticketing. Finally, I would like to introduce and thank Ty Christopher, our presenter, for preparing and presenting this webinar for us tonight. Renew Illawarra branch hosted a live meeting with Ty as a guest speaker 2 years ago. Ty at that time was the asset manager for our local power distributor, Endeavour Energy. He candidly analysed and discussed the challenges posed by increasing levels of rooftop solar to the current power distribution network. During his presentation, a couple of things became evident. As well as being a high-level manager, he was first and foremost a very competent power engineer. He's prepared to innovate and solve complex problems and demonstrated several examples of this during his presentation. He sees the current network as a tool to provide reliable and cost-effective service. Ty is now a power industry consultant and is passionate about reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from the current generation and distribution system. We'll now cross to Ty to tell us about his latest project. Thank you, Ty.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for the introduction and welcome everybody. Appreciate you dialing into things and sharing this webinar with us this evening. I'll just get the presentation up if I can. So we're here to talk this evening about reducing carbon emissions and energy bills at the same time. And no, I'm not here to sell everybody solar panels. There's more than enough of that going on and hopefully it can continue. The reality is we're here to talk this evening about a problem that almost nobody knows about because it's hidden by the invisible nature of electricity. We can't see electricity, and in particular, we can't see the voltage that the electricity is provided to each and every one of our homes, businesses, schools, and whatever at on a day-to-day basis. The reality is, however, energy is being wasted on a system-wide scale because electricity system voltages across Australia are higher than they need to be. We're operating in a challenged way because the current rules really don't provide any strong incentives for any entity to do anything about this. What's on the table, though, is the opportunity to save over $1 billion per year, as well as huge savings in terms of carbon emissions across the national electricity grid. For those that don't know, the national electricity grid is the interconnected grid between Queensland, New South Wales, the ACT, Victoria, South Australia, and Tasmania. Now, there's lots of solutions and technologies to optimise voltage efficiency that are emerging or that already exist. One of the existing ones is EcoVar technology. I will mention it here in this talk this evening, but I'm certainly not looking to flog a product, if you like, and you'll see why when we get to the details a little bit later on. The reality is there is a simple regulatory change that uses an existing in-place incentive scheme for electricity network businesses that, with a very simple augmentation, would put in place the right sort of cost signals and mean that you don't have to throw out the entire rule book that applies to the national electricity grid. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later as well. So I've made some bold claims in that introductory piece. So let's get into the detail as to why they actually are the way they are. The problem is energy is being wasted due to the force feeding of voltage to each and every premise across the grid. 20 years ago, back in 2000, the Australian standard officially changed. And what that meant is the nominal voltage, the voltage that all of your appliances are supposed to receive in your homes and businesses, moved from being the former 240 volts down to being 230 volts. And this was to align Australia with the bulk of the world who operate at that plus 200 volt level. It was meant to be a step on a journey at the time. However, a step change like that was inevitably going to cause issues with resetting the grid. So what happened was a tolerance around that movement in voltage was established. And that tolerance is very generous on the upside, i.e. 230 volts plus a further 10% allowance. The bottom line from all of this is that every single appliance that's been sold in Australia since 2000 is designed to operate efficiently at 230 volts. Every appliance that you've got, unless it's more than 20 years old, will operate better and more efficiently at 230 volts. Now, the two figures you see on the slideshow in front of you here are just summary results from two recent studies that were done. One of them by the University of New South Wales, and this was commissioned by the Energy Security Board. And this one consistently shows, I won't take you through the details of each of the horizontal bar graphs you see there on the bottom left. But the reality is that the median voltage that's supplied to the bulk of customers in South Australia, Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria are all between 245 and some as high as 249 volts. Similarly, the University of Wollongong has conducted a long-term power quality audit, which includes assessing voltage levels across the national electricity market. And again, consistently, it's showing that, with some exceptions in Victoria, and I would suggest that smart meters and the ability to see voltage that smart meters provide is contributory to this. But by and large, voltages are still sitting at 240, or as I mentioned, even 249 volts. Now, why is this so? As for those of us of a certain age can remember, it's so because of the laws of physics, and voltages drop. They reduce over the length of the power grid from the sending end down to the receiving end, and where customers connect to the grid all the way along. So the reality is voltages are sent at a high level, which you see on the left-hand side of the figure there. That means that through the middle of the supply envelope, customers are receiving what we'd call voltage in the ideal range. But still, we still experience customers that on the end of the line are experiencing low voltages, especially at times of peak demand. What are the negative effects of this? The main ones, the negative effects in particular of too high a voltage, is it limits the ability of solar to export onto the grid at times of high voltage. It also means that these appliances that for the last 20 years have been designed to operate satisfactorily at 230 volts are being fed more voltage than they need, and in many, many cases are being forced to operate in a way where they basically heat up due to the need to dissipate the excess energy that's generated within them. But it doesn't have to be that way. Fix the voltage, as we're calling this particular program, is proposing operating the grid, and it would only take a couple of years to implement this, in a way that operates much more closely around the centre point of that ideal voltage and reducing voltage that is received by nearly every customer across the grid. Now, previously, this would have been a real challenge because the solutions for the customers at the end of the grid and at the fringe of the grid who would experience an undervoltage situation as a result, the solutions to that would be quite expensive, quite capital intensive, more poles, more wires, more cables. New technology gives us a lot better solutions. And in particular, what we're calling the EcoVar units installed on the grid, as you see indicated in the slide here, allow the voltage to be held up when necessary and even pulled down when necessary to operate within this much tighter band, deliver much better service to customers. The benefits being more solar can export more energy more often, and everybody's appliances will use less energy. Now, a lot of debate from people when they're first hearing about voltage reduction, a lot of debate can ensue. The reality is what we're proposing here isn't a brand new idea. It's far, far from it. And while, yes, there are experts out there and there are people out there with an electrical background, electrical engineering background, can produce an example of a type of load in a house that will not use less energy if you supply it with less voltages. The classic might be, somebody would quote, an electric kettle. It's providing a certain amount of energy to heat a volume of water, and if you reduce the voltage, it's just going to take a bit longer to supply that same amount of energy to boil the water. Yes, that is correct. But for every type of appliance in the home that you can quote that won't reduce energy if you reduce voltage, the reality is you can find at least another 2 or 3 that will be significantly advantaged by reducing the voltage in terms of lengthening their lives, and in particular by reducing the amount of energy that they consume. This has been verified, and so what I've provided in this slide here is a series of web links that show that in studies conducted in Australia, as well as in the UK with Northwest Electricity, we've seen efficiency factors between what we call 0.6 and 1. What that means is if you reduce the voltage by 1%, you achieve between a 0.6 and a 1% saving in total energy flow to the customers connected to that particular part of the grid. Now, these aren't theoretical numbers, these aren't guesses, these aren't estimates done in a spreadsheet, and these aren't derived from modelling. These are derived from actual measurement of voltage reduction programs that have been successfully implemented in Australia and in the UK. So why aren't we doing this? If there's so much to be gained from reducing system voltage, why isn't it happening? Well, the reality is there are just no real incentives at the moment within the structure of the national electricity market. This is a bit of a hole in the donut. Now, I don't think for a minute that that's a deliberate construction. I think what it is a real piece of evidence that shows how over time and with the implementation of new technology, in particular new solar, new household appliance types and so forth, the rules that govern the national electricity market just aren't keeping pace with the technology that's out there to help. So we see generation, that's a competitive market. And to be frank, I doubt generators would be particularly excited about an initiative that involves everybody using less of their generated product, regardless of the source of that generation, renewable or non-renewable resources. Transmission, similarly, they just transmit the power. Whatever volume it is, they will transmit it. Distribution companies, they are the key to unlocking a voltage improvement program and a voltage efficiency program across the grid. However, like any business, they do require some sort of investment in order to implement voltage reduction. And as it stands at the moment, under the rules that exist, there is no incentive and no return for those distributors to undertake this investment. And this is because all of the benefits of voltage reduction under the rules as they exist actually flow to us, the end use customers, the people who use electricity each and every day. The proven solution that I've spoken about earlier is using these ecojoule units. That's what they look like up on the top right-hand side of this particular slide. And I won't spend too much time on this because we need to get moving towards the real results here and action points of this discussion. But what this is showing in the enlarged section of the graph on that slide is how when the EcoVar units are turned off, the voltages jumped up to unacceptably high levels. And when the units were installed, they were pulled down to much more satisfactory levels, closer to the 230 volt optimum point. Now, nothing in life is free. Implementing a voltage reduction program across all of the national electricity market will cost an amount of money. In fact, it will cost $200 million. Hold that thought for a moment though, because what you see in the figure in front of you here is the investment returns to each and every one of us as electricity consumers for that $200 million investment undertaken over 2 years, next year and the year after. What that shows is following that investment, the returns in terms of outright cash benefits will be just on $1 billion per year, every year, forevermore. There's also a value that we've assigned here to the emission reductions that will flow from this, but we'll get to those in the next slide. So if we fix the voltage, if we pull down system voltages across the national electricity market by around 4% to 5%, which is quite a modest reduction when you consider that we're starting way up at 245 volts or more. It will deliver $108 per energy user across the national electricity market. That figure is arrived at by $1 billion in savings, in total savings, just being divided by the number of people there are, number of consumers, like most of us on the call here, connected to the national electricity market. Equally importantly, I believe, is we would reduce carbon emissions by 3 million tonnes of CO2 per year, every year, forevermore. We would increase the ability of solar to connect to the grid by around 650 gigawatt hours per annum. That's not new solar connected, that's existing solar that's already connected to the grid, on most of it in a distributed sense, on homes and businesses, actually being able to export more of its energy more often as a result of grid voltages being brought down, still within Australian standards, but to the level that the Australian standard state should be the optimum level of 230 volts. It would increase grid security. By reducing the voltage across the NEM, we can reduce the demand on the national electricity market by 980 megawatts. Again, permanently removed. No need for new generation to serve that almost 1,000 megawatts of demand. And our estimates are that customers, each and every one of us, will save, when aggregated, around $317 million per year as a result of our appliances having longer lives because they're not being forced to deal with an excess input voltage most of the time. To really put this into some greater context, I thought I'd do a comparison. The comparison here is between, there's been a lot of talk in the media recently about new gas-fired peaking generation plant in the national electricity market. So if we do a comparison here, between a new 1,000 megawatt gas-fired power station and a system-wide fix the voltage, as we're calling it, using proven technology with EcoVar or similar units. We can see here in this comparison table, the capital cost of the gas-fired power station is $1.5 billion, $200 million for a fix the voltage campaign. The capacity that would be delivered as a result of this would be 1,000 megawatts, obviously, for the gas-fired power station, or at 980 megawatts for a fix the voltage campaign. CO2 emissions, depending obviously on how often it's used, but a reasonable estimate is that the CO2 emissions for the gas-fired power station would be 1.5 million tonnes per year in addition to existing emissions levels. Whereas reducing the voltage across the NEM would reduce CO2 emissions by 3 million tonnes per annum forevermore. Lead times, provided we get cracking now, lead times for either of these options are about the same, around 2 years to commission. And importantly, the impacts to customers would be diametrically opposed. A gas-fired power plant is new capital that would be going into the national electricity market. And while it's not for me to estimate exactly what the impact would be, the reality is somebody's got to pay, and that somebody is always the end-use consumer. So there would be an increase in power bills as a result of a new gas-fired power station coming online, whereas a fix the voltage campaign, a reduction in system voltage across all of the national electricity market, would result in a decrease of $1 billion per year in customer energy bills, distributed across everybody based on their actual energy use, averages out to $108 per grid connected customer per year forever. To summarise those benefits then, if we were to reduce the voltage to fix the voltage across the national electricity market, we'd deliver cash savings to energy consumers, $1 billion per year, $108 per customer. We reduce the national electricity market demand by 980 megawatts. We would reduce carbon emissions by over 3 million tonnes per year. And very importantly, if we were to use the technology that is available today, the EcoVar units are Australian designed, Australian developed, and Australian manufactured. So all of the equipment that we could use to implement this program, which in these COVID times would be an excellent kickstart for the Australian economy, at least that's supplied by the national electricity market, would create 1,000 or more jobs across the eastern states of Australia. So why hasn't it happened if it's such a great idea? Conversations have been had with AEMO, the Australian market operator, energy market operator. They are supportive in principle of what we're proposing and of voltage reduction. However, quite reasonably, they said they would require the rules to change to tell them to reduce the voltage. The Energy Security Board, again, were quite supportive of the concept, and when they're seeing the numbers that have been presented here, they believe it's quite compelling. But they did see that there was a need to undertake some further trials before finalising their position. The Independent Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal in New South Wales, and if you're seeing a trend here that there's a fair number of regulators involved in the electricity market, then you're definitely on the money there. IPART did not regard the issue as being a state issue to address and suggested that a discussion with the Australian Energy Regulator would be the best way forward. The Australian Energy Regulator, in the first instance, sought to see it as an Australian standards issue and say, well, go and get the Australian standards changed and then they can regulate to whatever it says. The reality is there's no need to change the Australian standard. The Australian standard already says 230 volts is the right voltage level and all appliances need to operate with it. what we're trying to do here is prevent the grid from operating at the uppermost of the allowable band for voltage and move down towards that ideal point of 230 volts. And the AER also did make comment that they thought that the states should really be the best place to regulate this. So an interesting dichotomy emerged, therefore, between the two. The circuit breaker, if you'll pardon the pun, in all of this is the bottom line in this particular slide. The Australian Energy Regulator already have what's called a Service Target Performance Incentive Scheme. Forgive the many acronyms in this particular presentation, but that's the business of the electricity market, unfortunately, people. Within this particular scheme, there is the provision to place power quality measures, one of which could be voltage. There is, in fact, a blank section in the actual rules themselves that say we intend to put, we being the AER, we intend to put power quality measures in here, but we haven't done so at this point in time. All that would be required to put a scheme in place to implement this in a regulatory sense is to include a voltage management measure in the existing target performance incentive scheme, which in a net sense would result in no more costs to electricity consumers. It would provide a financial incentive to the electricity distributors to better manage voltage to optimum levels of 230 volts, and it would deliver all of the benefits that we've spoken about here this evening. So a call to arms, or a request, if people do believe in this, to get involved. I'll leave this slide up for a little while, and I would encourage everybody, if you can, to do a screenshot of this particular slide, just so that you preserve these links. There is a change.org petition that's been started by Renew Illawarra. If we get enough signatures on that, we can take it to the Federal Energy Minister and ask him or her, such as they are at the time when we presented, we can ask him or her what they're doing to fix the voltage and give them a very strong signal that the people of Australia are becoming aware of this problem and becoming aware that they are being force-fed more energy than they need in their day-to-day lives, and they're sick of paying for that privilege. There's also a YouTube channel with some videos on there starting to come online over the next couple of weeks. I'd encourage you to have a look at. There's some more information about what you can do on fixthevoltage.org. There's also a Twitter campaign. Feel free to do that at Fix the Voltage. And there's also a Fix the Voltage Facebook page. So I'll leave that up there and encourage all of you to visit those sites. And I'll now hand back to our Master of Ceremonies, Greg, for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Ty. That was very enlightening. It is no surprise that our distribution network needs a bit of a tune-up. It's so a lot of things are happening to it recently, and new technologies is affecting it. It's also no surprise that you have been talking to the authorities and not getting very far. So we are really lucky that you and fellow engineers are running this campaign on our behalf. 3 million tonnes reduction, that could even put a dent in our greenhouse gas graph in the next 2 years, which would be fantastic.
It would indeed, Greg. And the point to remember here is it's not 3 million tonnes as a one-off. It's 3 million tonnes gone for good every year.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's good. A couple of technical questions. I don't quite understand how the 245 volts is affecting my solar panel's ability to export. Can you explain that a little bit more, please?
Absolutely. I'm mindful of, we've got a mixed audience here, so if I start getting overly technical, Greg, full permission to, by whatever means, pull me back from the edge.
I'll intervene.
Thank you very much. The way I describe it is this. The key link in there are two components in any home solar system. There are the actual panels themselves that sit on the roof, and then there's the inverter, and that inverter converts the direct current generated from the sun by the solar panels into an alternating current which is the language of the grid. And so it converts those and allows then the export of the energy from the solar panels either into the home or, where the home's not using the energy, out into the grid and into the street. Now, in order for that whole system to work and work properly, if we think of voltages like the pressure in water pipes, you've got to apply a little bit more pressure at one end to get the water to flow in the direction that you want down the pipe. So in the case of an inverter, it needs to provide a little bit of voltage at the household end in order to force the energy to be exported out into the grid. It's just like creating a bit of a downhill pathway, if you like, for the energy to flow. Now, all the inverters in the country are required to have an optimal operating range, and they have an upper limit which they cannot exceed in terms of their voltage that they can export at. That's set by Australian standards, quite appropriately so, to protect everybody's homes, to protect their appliances, and of course, to protect the grid. So what happens is, whatever the voltage level in the street is at an optimum level or reasonably low, well, then the inverter can export a little bit more, can bump the volts up a little bit, and the power can be exported. However, when the street voltage, the network voltage that we're talking about here, is very high, well, then in some cases, it can be that the inverter cannot climb over that without exceeding its own upper set point. And as a result of that, when voltages in the street go too high, usually at times of maximum solar potential export, because it's a bright sunny day in the middle of the day when many people are not at home and off at work, well, then the voltage in the street can rise up because there's no load on the street from customers using appliances, and solar is trying to export. And we're seeing this in places that have very high solar saturation, in particular in South Australia at the moment, whereby many of these solar panels are just outright unable to export because their inverters can't pump out a high enough voltage.
Excellent explanation. Thank you, Ty. Could you drop that screen? So last chance, screenshot that, and Ty will drop it in about 10 seconds. So I might have discovered a new thing that a lot of people I've heard say, oh, my television just broke and I took it into the repair and the power supply has failed. Is this one of the causes?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Good short answer.
I can take you into all the technical details of how the excess voltage is overstressing the switch mode power supply.
Right.
And it's just having to dissipate the excess energy it's receiving as heat, because it's just got a fixed output it needs to supply the television. Blah blah blah. Mm-hmm. Yes, is the answer.
Right. Very good. I get that. If anybody else has questions, please type them into the Q&A button now. So I have one from Rusty, and I'll quote, and you can guess who he's talking about. What has Angus, the Fed, and Matty, New South Wales, said about this information?
Well, I've got to be very careful here to not to do the right thing by people. Mm-hmm. Angus Taylor has some very capable and very senior advisors, and they are aware of this fix the voltage proposal. And the most senior one that I've spoken to was very supportive of the fix the voltage proposal. I'm obviously not going to name names, and I'm not going to presume that what I'm saying is representative of the views of the Federal Energy Minister. That's not my place to do so. But we've spoken to one of his senior advisors on electrical matters, and that person was very supportive of a campaign to reduce system voltages. In terms of in terms of the state level in New South Wales, we've had very good engagement at the New South Wales state government level in discussing this proposal. And I think in recent times, we'd say that Matt Keane, in particular in New South Wales, has nailed his colours to the mast when it comes to the energy markets, and much of in an as apolitical way as I can express this, I think what he's proposed is highly aligned to what we're talking about here in terms of increasing the efficiency of the grid and taking every opportunity to reduce carbon emissions in a way that also saves customers money.
Very good. I think quite a few of the people in our audience would be involved in trying to change things through political circles, and you're on the first base. You haven't been knocked out of court straight away, so that is good. I have another question. Should we be lobbying our federal members before they sign up to the gas lead recovery?
Yes. Again, another easy one. One of the points of the campaign, as I said in the intro here, and this is a difficult forum when you can never read your audience. I don't know how well people are hearing everything that I'm saying, whether I'm speaking too quickly. But the reality here is the big problem is people just don't know that this is going on. You can't see electricity. You can't see the voltage of your electricity, and you just get your energy bill each quarter or whatever, and no, you're not happy about it. So the first answer is, I think we need to get the word out there through these various campaigns and through people asking their distributors, what voltage am I being supplied? Particularly if you have a smart meter on your home, you can ask this. This can be known to you. And in particular, though, I think the reality is the empirical evidence is there in the early slides that I showed, with a recent study done by UNSW, with a long-term study that's been done by the University of Wollongong, that voltages are systemically high. I'll try that with my teeth in, systemically high across the grid. And people need to be asking the hard questions of their local politicians, of their federal members, etc. Why is this so, and what is being done about it? Because it's costing us all money and blowing carbon into the atmosphere that doesn't need to be.
Yes. So easy to fix, so hard to get going.
Correct.
Right. Now, hold on to your seats, everybody. We've got a technical question from, I'm not worried about you, Ty, the Mihai from Macquarie Uni. Would you please also comment on the unbalance issue on the three-phase low voltage distribution networks and how devices such as EcoVar could help? In simple terms, please, sir.
Mihai knows what he's talking about. The voltage unbalance that people talk about is there's the supply level in the street. If you have an overhead system, you can see it more clearly in your street. There are 4 wires at the lowest level. 3 of those are live wires, supply wires, and one of them is the neutral or the return path. Now, theoretically, each of our household loads should be, and each household should be balanced so that in total the balance across the 3 of those is close to even. The reality is, for historical reasons, that's not always the case. And Mihai, the good news is that the EcoVar units can help significantly with addressing the imbalance issues. They obviously can't rebalance and forgive me everyone, I'll talk to the questioner here. They obviously can't rebalance the resistive load components, but they can balance the reactive load components, and that goes a long way towards achieving a voltage balance across all 3 phases. For the amusement of the audience, the reason why a lot of the imbalance occurs is commonly called in the industry short arm linesman syndrome. Because in the days when it was all done on ladders, and apologies, they were all men, so that's just a factual statement. It's not meant to be anything other than that. They'd put the ladder against there, roll up, and they would always have to access that neutral wire to connect the house. And then they would have to access one of the live wires. Well, whatever live wire was furthest away and you had trouble reaching from the ladder would be the one that would inevitably have almost no customers connected to it. So voltage imbalance is a legacy of linesmen with insufficiently long arms. Okay,
more tune-up required by the sound of it.
Indeed.
So Rusty has come back with an observation, and I'll sanitize it a little bit. He says, but large electrical suppliers rely on your power supply issue to mess up, and so that you buy more stuff. So there's another driver for not not making the change. There's a question from an anonymous attendee saying, so using it on single households would not work.
Okay, good question. And this is where I said at the start, there are a number of different solutions and a number of different even products that are out there in the market for voltage management. Yes, you could place voltage conditioning equipment to step down the voltage on each and every home and each and every premise. That is a solution. That sounds to me like charging customers a lot of money to fix a problem that is not of their making. The EcoVar and solutions of its ilk is installed on the main grid, and each unit that's installed is able to service basically an entire street. So when you look at it from a pure economics perspective, by far and away, the most cost-effective solution is to install a relatively smaller number of units such as EcoVars or similar on the grid, only at the locations where they're needed. And then we are not faced with the situation of each and every household having to install their own power conditioning equipment to reduce the voltage as it comes into their premise.
Just to clarify, Ty, when you were saying on the grid, in layman's terms, you meant on the local power network on your street?
The local power, on the street power supply. Those wires that I was talking about on the poles, on that other side of the meter, but just at the street level. Exactly.
Here's a good question from St. James. Does it have to be a national decision, or can each energy supplier tackle it?
Each energy supplier could reduce the voltage on their local supply network. Absolutely. From a technical perspective, the answer is it can be acted on by each respective distributor. And in fact, at a tactical level, that is how a program to fix the voltage will have to be implemented. The challenge is the economics of the national electricity market and of each of these distributors. Their economic regulator is a federal economic regulator, being the Australian Energy Regulator. And at the moment, the hole in the donut that we're operating in here is the cost to implement fixing the voltage resides fundamentally with these distribution companies, and all of the benefits reside with end-use consumers, such as ourselves, and of course with the environment. And so at the moment, the change that's needed, and it's federal because of the energy regulation being federal, is to provide enough of a financial incentive to those energy companies to act individually to implement voltage reduction across the grid.
Okay, thank you. Keeping on the administrative side, Wade Elliott says, Ty, having spent many years on the DNSP side, can you tell me what that is, Ty?
That's the network companies, distribution network service provider.
Right, of the fence. Do you see other mechanisms other than STPIS, which, do you know what that is?
Yeah, that was the incentive program that I was talking about in the last slide. Yeah.
Right, okay, thank you. To enable this program, if the AER won't provide capital allocation, do you see AEMC's consideration of a rule change to allow charging for export as an option to enable this program? Whew, straight over my head.
Okay, we're in danger of going down the rabbit hole now, Alice. So I'll keep this more for the broader audience. And Wade, you have my number if you want to ask these questions. No worries, I'm happy to take your call. But there are a myriad of rule change solutions that could be put in place to incentivize voltage reduction across the grid. So the answer to Wade's question is the one that I've proposed here is not the only one. Absolutely. The challenge is, and I'll use an empirical example of this. Recently, there was a rule change implemented to allow distribution companies to own and operate remote power schemes for remote communities and individual loads such as communications towers. That would mean they don't have to build and maintain many kilometres of usually overhead line through bushfire prone country, etc. a very sensible rule change, an eminently obvious rule change, given standalone power system technology is as advanced and proven as it is now. That rule change was put through via an accelerated rule change process by the AEMC and rushed through their accelerated program. That rule change took 2 years.
Good answer, Ty. I got that.
So the answer is there's all sorts of rule changes you can make. The one I'm proposing that changes stippers could be implemented in a matter of weeks, if not a couple of months at the most. Other major rule changes, even if they're put through under the accelerated protocol, which quite frankly is only in danger of being mowed down by the Fox Glacier, would mean years before we could even start a voltage reduction program.
Okay, another technical question that I can understand. Neil Cairns asks, will the $200 million investment essentially be installing those EcoVar units across the whole NEM? It seems ridiculously cheap.
It does, doesn't it, Neil? That's the frustrating part about all of this. It is ridiculously cheap. Yes, the majority of that 200 million is for the installation of those units. The frightening statistic here that I was throwing so many numbers out in the presentation, I thought it was going to get lost, but now's the opportunity to say this. All of the modelling that's been done in actual case studies here in Australia indicate that 95% of the grid could take a voltage reduction of 5%, closer to 230 volts as we're talking about. So 95% of the grid could take that voltage reduction and no investment, no change, nothing would be required. Only 5% of the grid would mean that the voltage reduction at the sending end would dip customers under the acceptable minimum and would need propping up by some means. And in this case, it would be the EcoVar units as that's been used to derive this $200 million estimate. Within that $200 million is, however, an estimate of the costs for each of the distributors to go out and actually change the set points on all of their networks. That's going to, that's going to be people and machinery to go and do that, but not a massive amount of money by any means. So the bottom line there, it seems ridiculously cheap. It is, because 95% of the grid doesn't even need any remedial action. You only need to fix about 5%.
Great news. 2 solar questions. Why does, Anonymous has asked, why does solar get such a bad rap and why is it blamed for electricity's current high prices?
Oh, that's a very broad-ranging, much more broad-ranging question.
It's a piece of string question, isn't it?
It is, yeah. How long is it? Yeah. Look, I don't think solar's always blamed for high prices. I mean, the reality of solar generation is it is intermittent, especially at the micro level, at the individual home level. A cloud goes over and solar panel output drops. So the challenge is a lot of the perceived savings that and a lot of the costs, that exist in electricity supply are the fixed costs of the actual grid, the infrastructure to get the power to a person's home. Now, whether you need to use that grid all of the day or just for a few hours, you still need the same grid to be in place, and the same number of wires and transformers, etc., etc. So the real benefit of solar lies in its ability to contribute energy over a period of time and reduce CO2 emissions. So I would say that I think in the energy debate across the nation, vested interest seems to prevail more than fact-based discussion. And that is perhaps the pithiest answer to that question.
Mm-hmm. Another related solar question from U3A Moreland. The prevalence of solar tends to raise the voltage on hot days. One solution is to heat hot water systems in the middle of the day during summer, rather than at night, as coal is less common, particularly in South Australia and Tasmania.
You're spot on the money there, U3A Moreland. I'm not sure which is your first and last names there. But no, in all seriousness, that's spot on. That's exactly right. using these, basically using traditionally off-peak hot water as a thermal battery system. And the concept of when is off-peak, I think, has been changing significantly over recent years. And so using it to absorb some of the solar output during the middle of the day, I think, is an initiative that is past its time for implementation. I'm not going to make excuses. I don't know the reasons why it hasn't been implemented, but I do think that a lot of it is tied up in, as I said it before, in perhaps a way that was overly critical, but the reality is the fundamentals of the Australian national electricity market have been set up to be safe, reliable, and highly conservative. What that means is they're not agile and they're not keeping pace with the reality of how the grid is being used on a day-to-day basis. Thank you, Chris Moss. You have many names. Very good. Thank you. But what that means is the grid is being used now in ways that it was never designed and never intended for. In a technical sense, it's operating pretty darn well despite that. But the rules that are around it and the rules that surround the national electricity market are quite out of step with the technology that's available now, be it distributed generation, be it large-scale renewable generation, be it distributed storage with batteries on homes, or be it medium to larger scale storage for grid-scale batteries or community-sized batteries. The rules just don't facilitate proven technology rolling out across the grid at the pace that we as consumers, I believe, deserve it to be rolled out.
Thank you very much, Ty. We have now exhausted the questions, if not the speaker. So thank you very much for all of those who have participated in this webinar. Thank you very much to Ty, who has prepared the presentation. And this is just one of many presentations. I know Ty has been working very hard, almost full-time-ish, on this program to get that through to the keeper for us. We wish you all the best with that, Ty. So you're wanting us to, would you like to put that slide back up again, Ty?
Absolutely.
We can exit with that if you want to campaign some more on any of these channels, and also writing to your local members, as was suggested. All of that will help Ty. Will start to push the tide forward when Ty is arguing the case.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Greg. This is all about people power. The more people know that this is an issue, I'm sure the more people will be concerned about it and express that concern, and the more we can start to get the right sort of dialogue happening, get the attention of the people that matter, of our leaders, of our politicians, and of our energy regulators, and start getting them to really do something to fix the voltage.
Thank you very much, Ty. Thank you to all the participants. Thank you for the questioners, and thanks to Zach and Carrie.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Cheers.
Thank you.